Hello, Peter Stevenson. How are you today?
I'm very well.
Thank you so much for having a chat with me. It's wonderful to have you here. I know you're up late in the evening for this interview, so really appreciate you sharing your knowledge with me. So, first of all, I suppose just for people who are watching, I know you've got a really interesting career background. You've been in this space for a really long time. Can you give us a little bit of information about the kind of work that you personally do?
Yes, I'm a solicitor, a lawyer by background, and in the late 80s, I was becoming increasingly aware of how badly we treat animals. Um, and I became aware of the work of Compassion in World Farming. And I can't even remember how we quite made contact with each other, but at that time, the UK had a huge live export trade, a lot of exporting about 2 million sheep a year to the continent to the European continent for slaughter. And French farmers started attacking the trucks with British sheep because they felt they were being unfairly competed with by British sheep coming into France, and they set fire to some of the trucks and burnt the sheep alive.
Oh my
And
goodness.
so Compassion in World Farming brought a court case, arguing that our Ministry of Agriculture was acting unlawfully in letting these sheep go to France in this circumstance. And so I got involved in the court case as a lawyer, uh, and that's how I, I began to work with Compassion in World Farming. I've been with them, to my surprise, for over 30 years now. Um, and just last week, the British Parliament finally enacted legislation to ban live exports. So yes, it's been an interesting time.
Live exports have finally been banned from Britain.
For decades, compassion supporters, animal activists have campaigned relentlessly.
During years of campaigning, we never gave up.
Such fantastic news. I know when we all heard about it over here, we were absolutely thrilled. Can you tell us a little bit about what that was like when you heard that that had finally come through?
Oh, just just amazing because the organisation and many of the people in it, this has been a dominant campaign for years. And it was actually started. I mean, Peter Roberts was the man who founded Compassion in World Farming in the 60s, I think. And he was a farmer and he was getting worried about how intensive farming was becoming. And so his two big initial campaigns was against live exports and against battery cages for egg-laying hens. So this has been a kind of a 50-year enterprise, which, as an organisation, we've been involved with all this time. And as an organisation, we're not vegetarian or vegan. We're simply saying that animals should be reared, transported, and slaughtered to really good standards.
Fantastic. I did see as well on Compassionate World Farming's news page the celebration that was done just last week, just a few days ago actually, on the White
Yes.
Cliffs of Dover. Were you there?
Yes. No, I wasn't there because I live in Scotland. So our
Oh,
headquarters are down south of London, so it's not too far to Dover. But I'm able to do most of my, with Zoom and Teams, I'm now able to do most of my work from home.
fantastic. So I'll pull us back again a little bit. Can you tell us a little bit about that campaign that you undertook to ban live export? What went into it for those 50 years?
Okay. Obviously, the early part of the campaign, well, most of the campaign was in a pre-digital age. So a lot of it was, sending letters and postcards to the government, to government ministers, urging them to end the trade. Um, Demonstrations, at ports and outside government offices, always very peaceful demonstrations. We had a really good reputation that we, therefore worked well with the police. That our demonstrations were peaceful, but very clear in what we wanted. But the trade continued, and by the early 90s, it was 2 million sheep a year. So they were going for slaughter, and they'd be going all the way, many of them down to southern Europe, to Italy, Spain, Greece. And so it was a long journeys and awful slaughter conditions. Over the years, they've improved, but they were terrible at that time. In Spain and Greece, animals were not stunned at all, even though by law they should be. And the animals were leaving Britain on big ferry companies, the kind of big roll on, roll off ferries that were taking human passengers, but also vehicles, including these livestock trucks. And so we and other organisations really targeted passengers going on to this. And say targeted in a very kind of good natured way, but we gave them postcards. We said, do you know that animals are down in the hold? And I think a lot of people were very upset about that. And I think it was 1994, summer 1994, one day, P&O, the biggest of the ferry companies, just announced, no, we're not taking these animals anymore. I think they were really quite disturbed by the trade themselves. The two other companies involved, Brittany Ferries, Stena, in a sense had to follow suit reputationally. And so suddenly all three had backed out of the trade. And then an extraordinary period followed in which the exporters chartered their own ships and even planes to get the animals out of the country. And they'd find little ports or airports scattered around the UK, places that had never seen, the people in Dover were used to these trucks, the big, that's where all the trade was going. But suddenly it was coming to all sorts of towns that had never seen it before. Local people were appalled at seeing these trucks with tiny calves and lambs coming through their town. And it was a huge media interest. And gradually, this attempt to charter their own vessels, it began to fade away. And although there have been ups and downs, the trade had never hit that 2.5 million a year again. And so there was this gradual decline, but there was still a big trade of very young calves going from Scotland all the way down to Spain. Talking about calves 2 or 3, perhaps 4 weeks old in some cases. And we brought a court case against the Scottish government, arguing that actually, if you look at the EU transport regulation, which was still part of British law, these journeys were illegal. We fought a hard 10-month legal case against the Scottish government. Eventually, they refused to recognise that our legal arguments were correct. They said, we still disagree with you, but now we've found another reason why even we agree the trade is illegal, and so we're stopping it. And I think that was really the end. I think the government in, down south in Westminster thought the time has come. There was very little trade anyway. The time had come to finally ban this trade, and the law completed its journey through the London Parliament just about 10 days ago.
Fantastic. What a journey. I mean, my goodness. In your opinion, sort of being in Scotland, how are people reacting to the ban? Are they generally supportive? What's the feeling?
Yes, the people are supportive. It's not attracted the actual ban, the huge publicity we had in the 90s. Most people weren't even aware that the trade had been going on. But I think people are supportive. And although I'm sure many farmers are not happy about it, there's not been a big farmer protest. I think they recognise that this is such an unpopular trade that they're probably harming themselves. And I think the lesson from all this is, just for all animal welfare organisations, we just have to be tenacious. We just have to keep going, not getting downhearted when things don't quickly go our way. But, we have to have the confidence to know that for many ordinary people, ill treatment of animals is something that they find very upsetting, very unacceptable, and therefore there will always be a body of public support.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think to take us back a slight step because there may be some people listening today who aren't really familiar about live export at all. So could you just tell us why banning live export is so important, why this is such a monumental win?
Yes, okay. I mean, not looking just at the UK, but looking at the trade, the global trade. So, okay, I'll start within Europe because within Europe, millions of animals, cattle, sheep, pigs, are being transported long distances, mainly by road, from between the different European member states. And these road journeys cause great suffering. The animals are crammed into overcrowded trucks, and they become increasingly, dehydrated, exhausted, stressed as these long journeys wear on. Sometimes animals get injured and they can collapse onto the floor of the truck, and then they risk being trampled by their companions. In summer, with very high temperatures, uh, this can be really stressful for animals, particularly if there's delays. If the vehicle's stationary, because there's no forced ventilation in these trucks, and if they're stationary for long periods, which sometimes happens, for example, the border crossing between Europe and Turkey, animals can start to die. And in the worst cases, animals do die. For example, drowning when ships capsize. So in 2019, 14,000 sheep drowned when the ship taking them from Romania to Saudi Arabia capsized. So this trade puts huge pressure on animals. Young animals and very old animals suffer the most, probably. So Europe has a big trade in very young, unweaned calves. For example, from the Republic of Ireland, many of them also from Eastern Europe, from the Baltic countries and Poland, a lot of them coming into Netherlands, and they're being used for veal. Netherlands has a huge veal producing industry. And these are mainly the male dairy calves. Remember, in the dairy sector, female calves will be kept to themselves become cows and produce milk. The male calves are of no economic value. They're not going to produce milk. They're generally seen as not particularly the right breeds for beef. I mean, that's not actually true, but that's the kind of perception. And so male dairy calves are subject to these trades from big dairy producing countries to other countries that want to rear them for veal or beef. So these are the kind of problems that go on during the road journeys. Also, often animals are going for very long journeys without feed, water, rest. It's a terrible, inhumane trade.
That's interesting about because in New Zealand we call them bobby calves, the very young calves. There's a whole other area to delve into around bobby calves here. We've just had, I believe it was a year and a half perhaps ago, we had some new, wasn't legislation, but it was an idea that came out of one of our biggest dairy producers talking about not letting bobby calves be killed on farms. Usually that's what will happen to bobby calves in New Zealand, is they will just be dispatched on farms because, like you say, the male calves don't produce dairy, so are sort of superfluous to the industry. The sort of feeling on that, I think, because of a lot of the global understanding around what is happening to them. We've done a lot of work with SAFE as well, campaigning around the rights of dairy calves and sort of the fates that they have to suffer. There is a change in sentiment around seeing these animals as just sort of worthless. The reason they're called bobby calves is because they were worth a bob, in times gone by. So, yeah, so that's all changing now. But yeah, it's really interesting to hear that that's sort of one of the main tenets of live export in the UK, because it is very different to here in New Zealand. Speaking of New Zealand, we have had a ban in place for live export by sea. We still have live export by air that is legally happening, but in April 2023, so just over a year ago, our ban came into force after a 2-year wind-down period. Problematically, the government that's now in place are looking at potentially winding that ban back. So I guess to address that, obviously New Zealand was one of the first to ban live export by sea. In your opinion, how did that impact the global movement? Did you see a ripple effect in the UK from our ban?
It was a huge development, and I think it was one of the factors that, finally pushed the UK government to ban the trade. When you see another major country, major agricultural country saying, look, we can live without live exports, that really resonated and I think had an influence on us. So it would be, terribly disappointing if that ban is overturned in New Zealand. Because at the moment we're in a position of saying, for example, again, ironically, the European Union, which loves to claim it has the highest welfare standards in the world, and in one or two areas does, it's banned it was probably the first, set of countries to ban battery cages, for example. But it's probably now got the world's biggest and worst live export trade. Because New Zealand has stopped. UK has, Australia's announced it's going to end its sheep exports by 2028. And yet, I talked earlier about the long journeys within the EU, but the EU also has this huge live export trade, probably about 3 million cattle and sheep a year going to the Middle East and North Africa. Journeys, depending which part of Europe they're going from, anything from 5 to 15 days, these journeys to the Middle East. And these are sea journeys. Obviously, there'll be a road journey to the port. And sea journeys, while having some similar problems to road journeys, have very, very cruel and particular problems of their own. There's obviously was the New Zealand and Australian trade, but also big trades from Brazil and Colombia coming all the way up to the Middle East. And, just the loading of the animals onto these ships. And remember, these ships can carry possibly up to 100,000 sheep. So just the loading can take days. And the animals are often being prodded with sticks and electric goads to force them up, up quite steep ramps into the ships. As the journeys continue, the pens in the ship in which the animals are being kept, they get covered with urine and feces, so the floors are slippery, animals can fall and injure themselves, ammonia levels are high, making it hard to breathe. Again, some of these trades are happening, during very hot weather, extreme humidity. The feces can get into the water troughs, so the animals can't drink. There was a Brazilian vet who was asked by a Brazilian court to report on the conditions of a livestock vessel that was about to leave Brazil for the Middle East. And she was really quite shocked by what she saw. And she concluded that maritime transport of animals over long distances is intrinsically and inherently related to the causation of cruelty, suffering, pain, indignity, and the corruption of animal welfare in various forms. This is a vet talking about how horrific these journeys are. There was also the Australian vet, Dr. Lynn Simpson, who accompanied the animals on, I think it was about 50 live export journeys from Australia, because Australian law required a vet to be there on the ship. And her published account, is just horrific. She describes how animals are often enveloped in what she calls a fecal jacket. It just means they're covered in feces. And I've seen photos of this. It's unpleasant, obviously, for the animals. It prevents them getting rid of heat in really hot weather. The heat can't get out of their body. And of course, it makes them vulnerable to disease. But the most upsetting thing of hers I read was she said that big animals, the cattle, spending days lying on the hard pen floors, eventually suffer leg abrasions to the point where they can't stand. And so they can't get to the feed and water. They die of starvation or dehydration or have to be euthanized. And she said some cases, these abrasions are so deep that they're abrading the bone within the joints. So these long sea journeys, some parallels with the problems in road journeys, but some pretty awful problems all of their own.
It's really interesting to hear about, what the inherent problems are with these long journeys, because one of the things that the New Zealand government has said about potentially bringing back live export by sea is that they would only do it if a ship was built to a gold standard, is their words, gold standard ships. And one of the I see your face. One of the pieces of making a ship gold standard, making the journey gold standard, is to have a vet on board. Do you think that that's a possibility? Like, is there ever a point at which there would be an okay? Yeah, I'll let you answer.
It just doesn't sound very likely. For a start, most of the ships were never built as livestock carriers. They've been converted from other purposes like car carriers. So, they've not been designed with animals and ventilation and these kind of things in mind. And I suspect the cost of building a livestock carrier that was just designed for livestock might be quite prohibitive. Yes, the idea of a vet, of course, if you're going to do it, there must be a vet on board. But as Lynn Simpson's account shows, and it's a publicly available document, even with a vet on board, the conditions are just horrific. So having a vet on board, yes, important, but it doesn't really solve this. I mean, I really urge New Zealand to stick with its ban. It's gained huge, international praise for that ban, and the idea that there's going to be a gold standard is just not credible. There isn't really a way of transporting animals over long sea journeys or long road journeys that's compatible with good welfare.
In line with thinking about potentially New Zealand going back on their ban, how do you think the international community would react?
I think people would be, very disturbed. New Zealand has gained itself, as a major agricultural country, a lot of kudos, a lot of praise for its ban. For this recognition that the animal sector has to operate to high standards, and to go back on it, I think, would be very damaging to New Zealand's international reputation, and that even affects not just governments but ordinary consumers. I think we'll get to the point where you pick up New Zealand produce and as a consumer in this country, and you're going to think, no, I don't want this. This is a country that went back, on what it had been very rightly praised for and has now gone back to an immensely cruel trade.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you. If you could give one message to the New Zealand government about their decision that they've got in front of them now, what would it be?
Oh, stick to your live exports ban. The animal agriculture has many, inhumanities and cruelties, which slowly, between animal welfare organisations and governments and farmers, slowly things get better and improve, though there's still a long way to go. New Zealand government, don't go back on what was such a humane and bold move. Stick to your ban.
Can you tell me a little bit more about the Brazilian court case? What were sort of the ramifications of that?
Okay, so Brazil has a big trade in cattle going by sea to the Middle East. Similar length of journeys probably to those from Australia. They're probably taking 19, 20 days, depending on weather conditions. And a few years ago, a Brazilian animal welfare organisation brought a court case, arguing against the trade. And the judge at that point actually ruled in their favour and said live exports shouldn't be taking place from Brazilian ports. But I think it was overturned on appeal, and it was referred back to the judge. And finally a decision was issued last year, in which the judge again said that live exports shouldn't be taking place from Brazilian ports. I mean, a really good, a very detailed, 80-page decision. My understanding is that it's still not enforced, it's subject to appeal, or maybe it needs the government to finally act. But reading it is, very heartening. He had three main reasons for reaching his conclusion. Firstly, he said, look, because the conclusion of the vet who inspected the ship, she was just horrified at the conditions on the ship. And the judge said, that it's important that the Brazilian, that they were in breach of Brazilian law on animal transport, that these apply even once the ship leaves Brazilian territorial waters. And he said it's illegal to transport the animals in such conditions. He then said it was illegal for animals to be slaughtered abroad in ways that wouldn't be allowed in Brazil, because of course slaughter in the Middle East is sadly appalling. And he drew an analogy with the extradition of people. He said Brazil would not allow somebody to be extradited to another country if they were at risk of a penalty that wouldn't be permitted in Brazil. And he said, by the same token, we shouldn't be sending animals to countries where they're going to be slaughtered in ways that would be illegal here. He then looked at the Brazilian constitution, which says that animals shouldn't be subjected to cruelty. And he said, look, the mere fact that you say that in the Constitution means you'll recognise them as living creatures, as sentient beings. You wouldn't have to talk about them not being subjected to cruelty if they weren't living beings. And the fact that they are sentient living creatures means, again, we shouldn't be subjecting them to such inhumanity. So that Brazilian case was perfect. It looked at the journey, it looked at what's going to happen on arrival, it looked at the status of animals as sentient beings. And it was really exciting to see that. I mean, very sadly, it doesn't seem to have changed the situation in Brazil. But this is how obviously this is how movements are built. Having a court case which is so powerfully expressed in its condemnation of live exports is all of what builds, both in Brazil but globally, a sense that this trade is unacceptable. Maybe that's part of the message to the New Zealand government. Look at the Brazilian court judgment and apply its principles, i.e., don't scrap your ban.
Yeah. It's interesting, hearing about the Brazilian court case and then thinking about New Zealand potentially going back on the ban, and then going back to what you said sort of at the start of our conversation about the importance of these movements to have the resilience and the stickability to stick with this through the thick and thin, through the hard times, because I think, here in New Zealand, it has felt like a bit of a knock to hear, this is a long time of campaigning and standing at ports and writing petitions and speaking with lawmakers and,
Sure.
all of that work that's been done. And it was such a huge celebration just last year, and then to hear that it might all come back. So it's nice to hear, those words of just stick with it. This is what it looks like sometimes in this movement.
Yes.
Yeah. Would you have anything else to say to New Zealand campaigners who are feeling a little bit knocked back at the moment?
Oh, my heart is really with you. I can't imagine how I and my colleagues would feel if suddenly the UK turned around and said, oh, we're scrapping our ban. You must be devastated. But yes, the only message can be is to stick with it, to get back to campaigning. I'm afraid the powerful interests that support things like live exports and factory farming are powerful, and we just have to dig in and continue our campaigns, recognising that there's often huge public support. Many of the people, much of the public doesn't spend lots of time thinking about this. People have got lives to get on with, jobs to do, families to look after. But an awful lot of people are really pleased that there are things like animal welfare organisations who are trying to get things right. So pick yourselves up and just get back to it. And hopefully with some really good campaigning, you may persuade the government not to scrap the ban. And if they scrap the ban, just get back to it. So, sorry, it's easy for me to say, sitting a long way from New Zealand, but there's no other answer.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you. So what's next for Compassion in World Farming then? You've got this one under the belt. What's next?
I don't think there's, if you wish, one specific, although probably the main thing, and this was a huge knockback for us, we, a few years ago, there's something in the European Union Treaty, because remember, although Britain's left the European Union, we have offices in much of the EU, so we're still very engaged in Europe. It has what it calls a citizens' initiative. In other words, the EU treaty says, look, if you get 1 million signatures on a petition from, I think it's got to be at least 7 different countries, whatever, it's quite regulated, then this forces the European Commission to at least think very carefully about what's being asked for. And we got well over 1 million signatures on a petition asking for an end to the use of cages and crates. So, because although the EU's banned the battery cage, it still has allowed hens to be kept in the enriched cage, which is much better than the battery cage. It banned sow stalls, but said that farmers can still use them for the first 28 days of the pregnancy. Farrowing crates are still used for sows. So, there's a number of cages and crates. And we got a really positive response to our citizens' initiative, this petition from the European Parliament and the Commission. They said, yes, we're going to introduce legislation to ban this. And they even said, in fact, we'll sort out all sorts of other animal welfare problems. They were really very, very positive. And then about a year ago, they started getting cold feet. And something that looked like a done deal was just abandoned. In the end, the only piece of new legislation they've introduced is a proposed new regulation on animal transport, which is very weak. It's not stopping live exports to the Middle East and North Africa. It's just improving one or two things along the way, but it's letting this trade continue. So again, this promise of a ban on cages and crates just disappeared. And so, yes, we and lots of other animal welfare organisations in Europe are having to pick ourselves up and say, okay, how do we go back to trying to get this ban? And this was years of work getting to this point. The current European Commission and Parliament, they're on a 5-year cycle, so they're kind of coming to the end of that cycle. There'll be a new commission and a new parliament later this year. So we're at the moment kind of, strategizing as how to get that back into the kind of political sphere. So that'll be a major thing. Another thing that I and my colleagues are working on is banks. If you look at factory farming, where does the money come from? Because not many people have the money to sort of set up a big factory farm. It comes from banks. The big commercial banks pour millions into supporting factory farming, and the big agribusiness companies that run factory farms globally, as do the big bodies like the World Bank, and there's a body called the International Finance Corporation, which is part of the World Bank group, who finance, unbelievably, because these are ultimately run by governments, they're public bodies, that they financed a multi-story pig farm in China. So there's a whole bunch of problems to try and persuade financial institutions to stop pouring money into factory farming.
That's incredibly interesting because, obviously all right, but I'd never really thought about who was financing factory farms. Go for the jugular. Incredible. What an incredible way of doing things. And I was going to ask you, in terms of that getting knocked back, because we're doing the same sort of work here in New Zealand. We have a ban on battery caging now, but we have still got, you've called enriched cages, we call them colony cages here.
Yes.
Much of a muchness, really. They've got a scratch pad and they've got a perch, and
Yeah.
that's about it, really. But in terms of that, I suppose a question that I'd be really keen to hear from you, and it's okay if we move away from it, but in terms of that incremental work that we have to do in this movement, how do you think you keep the public interested when it's the sense that we've ticked something off, we've done it, we've got rid of battery cages, but yet something else takes its place? How do you keep people on side?
I think it's a real challenge because, as I said earlier, this is no criticism of people, but people have many things that need attention in their lives. And if they feel something has been solved, it takes a lot of work to get them aware that there's still a problem, that the message has got to be don't buy eggs from enriched caged hens, buy them from free-range hens. Again, I don't think there's any easy answer. One just has to kind of keep finding ways to get the media interested, to get the public interested. Where we have, I say we, I mean lots of organisations have made good progress, is with retailers and the other big food businesses, big food manufacturers, the big fast food restaurants like McDonald's. And those, again, a lot of problems still, but they, some of these companies have adopted quite high welfare standards, not as high as I'd like, but nonetheless, and they, like the banks, they have huge power. If major supermarkets say, this is the standard we want, that's what happens. And so even though we've not, despite all our efforts, got a ban on enriched cages in the UK, all the big UK supermarkets have said they will no longer sell eggs from these enriched cages from 2025.
Oh, fantastic.
So, it doesn't solve the problem totally. It's not as good as a ban. But nonetheless, having got these big retailers on board, one can make huge progress.
And I know we've gone far and away off the questions that we had spoken about earlier, but this is really fascinating, so I hope you don't mind if I pick your brain a little bit more. In the time that you've spent in this movement, in the animal welfare space, have you noticed that there's been a shift in general public sort of awareness, sentiment around the way that we use animals in society?
Oh, yes, there's no doubt there's been a shift. More and more people are, willing to spend more to get higher welfare produce. But it's also limited. As I say, people have got many things in their lives they have to think about. Some people have very little spare money and therefore, feel compelled to go for the cheapest. So, yes, there's been a shift, but there's still... this is still a long way to go. As a movement, and I'm again now talking globally, we've achieved so much. When you think in many countries, battery cages have been banned or are on the way, they're being phased out. But there's still so many problems, and those problems are ultimately stemming from, an attitude amongst many people that they want the cheapest food possible, and they're therefore unwilling to say, no, we want our governments to ban a range of cruel practices, even though it might push up the cost of food. Not necessarily hugely, but in many cases, yes, it will. It will mean some increase in cost. So there's still, for all the improvements, the way that we as a species treat farm animals is just heartbreakingly horrific. One can think of so many animals. I mean, one thing we're very engaged with, and I believe Animals Australia is also very much involved with, is the slaughter of pigs with high levels of carbon dioxide gas. One sees the pigs in this gas, struggling to escape, hyperventilating. It's ultimately utterly inhumane way of killing pigs. And yet here in the UK, about 85% of our pigs are killed in this way. Government has known about this problem for 30 years. It's in the 90s the science was first showing, just how cruel this method is. And yet, we have an industry that will happily tell consumers that we have humane slaughter. So, and that's just picking out one problem, one abuse out of many. And I don't say that to be downbeat. I also have great optimism, great pleasure in what we've achieved, great optimism for the future, but we mustn't delude ourselves, even when we have major successes like we've just had in the UK about a ban on live exports, that a huge amount remains to be done.
It's hard not to get downbeat sometimes, but you're right. There have been huge strides, and I do think we need to take stock of that, and really, cherish those wins that we do have. One of them, of course, being the ban that's just come through for Britain on the 20th of May. That's correct, isn't it? The 20th of May?
I can't remember the exact day. It was probably a few days before that. I'm just looking at my computer. It's the 22nd today. And I love your term cherish. Yes, we must really cherish all our achievements while being aware that there's an awful lot still to be done. But that's the case with any, if you go back over the years and the centuries, that's the case of any, huge social movement. If you look at the huge struggle in the US to change race relations, and obviously a struggle that's not yet completed. If you look at the huge changes in the position of women in society, and again, that I'm very aware much remains to be done. But there have been, in my lifetime, there have been huge changes. When I was growing up, women didn't really, in most cases, have jobs. They were housewives. They had very, very limited scope in life. And there have been really worthwhile changes, but they're not perfect. And the same with animals, big changes, but a long way still to go.
Yeah. And it's interesting, I've always struggled in this movement as well on that balance between, I suppose, using all the numbers and all the myriad ways that animals are used and abused often in society, and then also balancing that with, trying to pinpoint those places where change can be found. So it's almost like trying to tell this nuanced story to people, especially as a communications specialist, trying to tell that story without having those numbers flatten you, that really flattening effect of just millions and billions and trillions and bodies, and it's tough, right? It's tough.
One area we've done increasing work on, really since the 90s, is to argue that these systems are not just cruel to animals, but are an environmental and health disaster. Because on factory farms, animals are fed on soy and cereals, wheat, maize, barley, and they convert these crops very inefficiently into meat and milk. There's a lot of data on this. Two major reports over the years have said that if the crops globally that are used to feed animals were instead used for direct human consumption, we could feed an extra 3 billion people a year. It's staggering. And yet so often the industry and the big agribusiness companies say, oh, we're doing all this for food security. They're not. They're undermining food security. And so we've found these environmental and food security arguments very helpful, particularly in those parts of the world where animal welfare really may not be a priority. Then this can be important. And the link between factory farming and animals and intensive crop production is rarely understood. But this huge demand, and remember, in some countries, in the EU and the US, these are government in the EU government figures. Almost 2/3 of all cereals are used to feed animals. It's not marginal; it's staggering. And these crops are being grown themselves very intensively with monocultures and agrochemicals. This leads to soil degradation, biodiversity loss, overuse and pollution of water. These are terrible, terrible systems from a food security, from an environmental point of view. And I think it can sometimes be helpful to point these things out, because it'll bring some people into the debate who maybe feel not that concerned about animal welfare, but are going to respond to these other issues. And actually, just last week, the World Bank produced a report, Recipe for a Livable Planet. So focusing on the global agri-food system and looking at it from the climate change point of view. They said without change in the agri-food system, it will not be possible to meet the Paris climate targets. They said that without change, we will have an unlivable planet. This isn't an NGO speaking, this is the World Bank saying that, what we have at the moment will take us to an unlivable planet. We as animal welfare bodies need to press these things home and say to people, look, this system isn't just cruel, it's taking us totally in the wrong direction. There's so much use worldwide, for example, of nitrogen fertilizers. There's a huge belief in them. A lot of them being used to grow feed crops for animals. And the World Bank's being amazing at the moment. Another World Bank report last year called Detox Development said that in many regions, nitrogen fertilizers are now suppressing, not increasing productivity.
Really?
And no, it amazed me. But I think what happens with fertilizers, initially they have this huge boost of productivity, but they acidify the soil, and eventually, they're actually reducing fertility. And of course, if farmers can just chuck fertilizers on the field, they're not looking at kind of regenerative ways of building soil quality through cover crops, through compost, through animal manure. There's a huge good future for animals in regenerative farming and integrating crops and livestock. So all these are, although in the end, from my point of view and Compassionate World Farmers' point of view, our concern is about animal welfare, we possibly need to deploy these broader arguments as well to engage people who are not that interested in welfare on its own. Gosh, this has taken us an awful long way away from live exports.
Always was going to happen. It was always going to happen with such interesting topics to cover. So massively thank you for going on that journey with me around the globe of animal welfare. But it's so interesting bringing in, that environmental argument. And I think people, especially here in New Zealand, I am seeing that people are making those connections now, good. Which is really, really good to see, especially younger people marching for the environment and understanding the links there. Of course, there's a way to go. Of course there is. But, it's starting and it's so exciting to see. So that's one of the aspects that we're talking about, that does give me a bit of hope is, the young people they're switched on.
That's great.
All right. Is there anything else that you think we should cover off before I let you go, seeing as now it's probably about 10 o'clock at night?
No, I think we've really covered, a broad waterfront.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for joining me today, Peter. It's been incredibly enlightening and wonderful to make a connection with a like-minded person across the sea.
It's been good talking to you.